narrowly defined where people are free to self-express and be accepted, then we'd be in a much better place. And
Thank you. Yeah, my name's Tim Nafziger. I've lived here in Ventura, and before that Ojai, for about 12 years. And I think I'm excited about this conversation because masculinity is something I've thought about, and it's been part of my life, my whole life. And I've always been interested in pushing the edges of, or challenging some of the ways that dominant culture thinks about masculinity. Some of my experiences in elementary school of bullying have always made me aware of how masculinity can be associated with domination or control, and I'm always interested in how does vulnerability and compassion and kindness fit in with how we think about these things. And so I've tried to be part of pushing back against some of those things in various contexts. I'm a Mennonite, I'm a writer, I'm an organizer, and so I'm excited to explore this conversation further with the two of you.
again, we're things that will be helpful to anyone else who might be listening. So we can start by opening up with like a context question, so that we can kind of frame where we're coming from. And so the question is, how do you personally define masculinity or the idea of being a man? So.
Well, and for starters, like you said, this is our conversation, and I just want to preface is that I'm not necessarily an expert on it, but obviously we live in a society that is dominated by males, and for me, definition of masculinity is what it means to be a man. And growing up, that was always to be the protector, the hard worker, the one that provides for the family, the one that shows no emotions, is more of a power and control. But it was also confusing because my mother was very important in my life during my childhood, and she would challenge that. And I think that's what I've struggled for a lot of times is, well, what is masculinity? Because she would challenge us. She would actually showed us how to knit, show us how to sew, made us fold our clothes, clean our clothes. So I've struggled with how that interprets my manliness, my masculinity. So I defined it of who I am, and for me, that's the conundrum that I've kind of, in sometimes I've struggled, but at times I feel comfortable. I go back and forth. So what is really masculinity? It's like
That's a good question.
and that's why we're here. And so I think I've been good where now how I define my masculinity, but that's my opinion what it means.
Yeah. I don't know. For me, I think it's a loaded term. I'm gonna be perfectly honest. It's just loaded to me, and I think because of religious influence, cultural influence, it's almost an artificial thing, because biologically men are men. That's one thing, but then there's the whole psychological part of it where the expression, the individual expression comes from. But personally, for me, before I can even get to that, I want to talk about humanity, the humanity of it, and the humaneness that should be a part of it. So even when you're looking at both sexes, we're humans first. And then if we can respect that part, I think the rest will become easy. So in my definition, it's like we're human. And if we could just kind of figure that out, I think, that would help. But in terms of defining masculinity, I think there are inherent traits to being a man. They're just things that are inherent to you being born in a body that is biologically male. Strength, and I think even some psychological processes might be, you know, differing from the way females would think. But I still don't see that as, you know, the way it's kind of at me been defined. It's not about being aggressive or shutting down parts of yourself, you know, in order to fill this role. And so I don't know if that's really defining it, but you know, it's giving my thoughts at least on what it is to me. So I'll leave it there for now because I know we're going to talk a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, you know, I was thinking about some of my earliest, experience of gender were growing up in a Mennonite congregation where older men and women still sat on opposite sides of the congregation. So like the families would sit together. The younger folks had decided they didn't want to have that segregation, but that was still how my grandparents, I can remember my grandparents sitting on opposite sides, and they both, my mom's parents both had, wore more traditional plain Mennonite clothing. So for my grandfather, that was like a, what looks like a Nehru jacket or called a plain suit. For my grandmother, that was a cape dress, which was a dress with an extra layer of modesty and a covering. And so it was very clear and different gender roles. But my mom really pushed back against that as I was growing up. She became Sunday school superintendent in the church that we went to, and some of her relatives left the church because that was too much power for a woman to have. And so she really raised me, like you mentioned the role of your mom, to like learn how to clean, learn how to hang the laundry. It was very important to her as a feminist that be part of what I grew up with. And so then in my 20s and 30s, another big influence for me that's important in thinking about masculinity is having community and being part in the Mennonite church of fighting for LGBTQ inclusion, including genderqueer and trans folks for whom gender was separate from biology. And so for them, important to have gender expression that fit with, as you said, the psychology, their sense of who they were. And so that was also important for me in realizing, like, oh, part of, I don't identify as genderqueer, but being part of a movement that was committed to queering ideas of gender in a particular community, specifically the Mennonite community in the U.S. And so in that context, it helped me think about, okay, how can I work within what it means to be a man to really push the boundaries in some ways of how we think about that, of masculinity. And so those ideas of compassion, listening, vulnerability, alongside characteristics of leadership and being willing to take risks in certain situations. And so those are some of the things that I think have formed the story of masculinity for me.
Yeah. Cool. All right. How was that?
Good.
Okay, cool.
Well, you're sounding good.
Good.
All right, so
Okay.
Yeah.
we can move into the.
Yeah, that
Oh,
whole,
yeah.
that whole question.
I got it. Stuck in the middle.
In case I need to take notes. Sonia, in this part, we can move into the main part, I guess, if that seems like that.
Yeah.
If you guys are okay with that.
All right.
Yeah.
So it'll just be us moving from all of these opening things that we did into a more deeper conversation, you know, shared experiences, because I have some things that you said that I'm like, yeah, I identify with that, you know, kind of thing. So this is going to be our crosstalk exchange, kind of sharing part. Yeah?
Good.
Cool. All right, here we go.
Ed, you good?
All right, so let's start with you.
Let's start with me.
Well, I guess I'll say, I think what's important here is for us to kind of let our guard down a little bit. It might be a little scary, you know, to sharing personal things, knowing that, you know, we're immortalizing this, but I think our viewpoints are just as valid as anyone else. And I know you have brought up the point that, you know, you're not an expert, and that's not even where we're going with this. It's, you know, you are an expert at being a human being. You're an expert at being the man that in the life that you live, just like, you know, we have. So
No, and I think that's very valid. I do resonate, or not resonate, but some of the things that you guys said, I, as a young adult and or as a teenager, and I would bring either different genders. I remember bringing a friend from college. He was Asian, but feeling also this type of tension within my friends, that not him knowing how to interact with them and how to, I mean, I know this is, but I feel like because they have a different way of being and his masculinity was different than mine.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that had a big, it was just really confusing at times, like, okay, where do I sit in this whole system, this whole society? And I think that my core beliefs and challenges about what it means to be a man are confusing. And they were confusing when I was first being a young man. And also, I'm because of my mom's influence on me, I was kind of more, I wouldn't say feminine, but I believed in equality. I believed in a lot of human beings. And people would think that I wasn't straight, and and it was just confusing. It was a confusing time in my life. And I've never really talked in public about this because it's so, because we come from a Latino culture, that's like unforbidden. Like you can't talk about it. And I finally, I even would even question myself and say maybe I'm not straight. But it took me a while to struggle through that and really be well in my skin, mm-hmm. and feel like I was a man, feel like I was part of this community. Emotional, intelligent, how to be okay with my feelings and say, no, that's actually being a man. Mm-hmm. It's okay to show emotions, especially now that I have 2 daughters. I think it's allowed me to be more free and more stable. Yeah. So I still feel like I need to do more work on defining, but in general I feel like I have a good solid foundation of self-respect and loving and caring, and not necessarily judging other Latinos for the masculinity, but learning, like saying, okay, we need to have a conversation about this. Mm-hmm. And it's important for us to share and talk about. In my community, a lot of times we're afraid to really get into what do those emotions really mean. Yeah. For example, I had a conversation with a friend not too long ago, and he was like, well, she's saying she wants her own house, but I'm like, but what is, or like she doesn't want to cook, but I'm like saying, what does she really want? Like, what is she really asking for? Because it's not that, it's something else. And I think we're afraid to talk about that. A lot of times we're afraid to go down because we are letting our guard down, and we're actually accepting what others want. Not, you don't have to agree with it, and they're afraid that they have to be the dominant, they have to be controlling, they have to be always right.
You mean men?
Men.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Yeah. So that's where I tend to push back a lot now that I feel more comfortable what I view masculinity is about, or being a man.
Well, to me, it's interesting what you brought up, all of what you brought up, because what just kept rolling around in my mind was this whole concept of roles, this construct, the social construct of roles. Creates part of the problem, like what you were saying, you were differentiating between, what your mom was teaching you and what your dad was teaching you. It's like, well, my mom was teaching me to, do laundry and wash the dishes and everything, but my dad was telling me to do, all this kind of stuff. And because we've assigned activities in life to these gender roles, is also problematic, to me, also the same when it comes to, you brought up emotions. When when all of us as human beings, male or female, have this full spectrum of emotions, but we narrow them down into, well, okay, this is the male spectrum, this is the female spectrum, and if you in the middle, yeah, something wrong with you, kind of thing. And so I think that's the problem. I think if we can start deconstructing, these as I was preparing for this, I was thinking about this cult of culture. Just these, these ritualistic things that we get into that are unshakable and almost seem like unchangeable. Even though our world and our society around us is changing, there's this strict adherence to, no, it's always been this way and it can't change, and we don't evolve that way. We don't grow. And so it makes perfect sense to me why anybody, including myself, would be confused about any of this. It's like, okay, so where do I fit in? And if you're like me, who grew up in a single parent home raised by their mother, that was my role model. And I got teased and bullied because I was expressing what was modeled before me. And so even before I had a thought about who I wanted to be or who I was already being labeled because of certain expressions that were natural to me. You know what I'm saying? So, and then it's I went through the whole confusion state and all that kind of stuff. So I definitely understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, one of the things that both of you are highlighting for me is that patriarchy doesn't just happen. These roles don't just happen, they're very specifically enforced by our experiences. And so I was thinking about, I shared a little bit about my mom earlier, who modeled feminism and some of these values. My dad didn't push those things around patriarchy as maybe the physicality of it. I got from him nerdiness as a good thing, right? Which doesn't nerdiness,
okay.
Doesn't quite fit with some ideas of masculinity. The last decade or two, we've seen the rise of nerds as billionaires who have done a lot of damage in the world. But growing up in the '80s, that model wasn't really out there.
That's true. I'm finding that really interesting that you bring that topic up. But
And so when I went to school, my nerdiness and what I got from my mom was not within the gender norm. I was not experienced in performing. The term I've learned since then is like gender performance, right? I didn't have those skills very well, and so the boys in my class picked up on that. And I was with the same cohort at a Mennonite elementary school for like 8 years, from kindergarten through 7th grade, and just experienced verbal and physical bullying all through there that was very explicitly about enforcing this is what masculinity is, what they were picking up from their dads, right? Some of through, I realized looking back, they were physically abused by their parents, right? By their fathers, most likely. And so they passed that on, and like as explicit as I was sitting funny one way, and I still remember sitting in a strange way, and one of the bullies said, "Oh, you're gay," or something like that. Those were the words, the scary words that were used to enforce and say, "This is what it looks like." And we play Smear the Queer, where we run around and try to tackle the kid with football. These very specific homophobic and gender reinforcing kind of mechanisms, and they were just part of the playground culture in that context. And so it took me a long time to realize that's what's happening there. But I still have reactions when I feel like those bullying things can still trigger me, often around some of the ways that traditional masculinity shows up.
I fully agree with that because, like you, very much bullied in school. I mean, even to the point where, all the punk, sissy, I don't think they used the word gay back then when I was younger, but, punk and sissy and all this kind of stuff. I would, get teased like that on the playground and everything. And largely in part because I had a stronger connection with females. So like I would always be hanging around with the girls and talking to them and all that kind of stuff. And the boys would not respond well to that. And so that was kind of part of how it came in. But it got so bad at one point that, the administration of school, because I was, getting into all of these fights and stuff all the time, or being bullied into fighting or whatever, that in order for me to be able to get home safely, the administration made the decision to let me out of school 5 minutes early in front of everybody. And I'm realizing now how much of an impact that had, that I had to be singled out in this way just for my own safety, because of who I was, nerdy. I was, a high scoring student with my grades, and you know, and very expressive, you know, and again, exhibiting traits that were passed on to me from the only role model I had in home for the most part, with the exception of my mom's boyfriend, which we'll probably get into because that was a whole nother mess. But the whole idea, like you're saying, like with the bullying and the culture, when people say a lot, you know, as the saying goes, when they say this stuff begins at home, it actually does, because when we go to school as young people, we bring what we've been taught at home with us. It doesn't come from just anywhere, you know. And for those of us who have to suffer through bullying, you know, just because we appear different in some way and not even being given a chance to explain, because I think the tragedy of it all is when the adults don't make it any better. Meaning, you know, they reinforce those cultural norms on you. Well, you're a boy, you need to do this, whatever. Like, you know, with my mom's boyfriend that we were living at the time, he's like, oh, you need to learn how to fight. You need to learn, you know. So trying to indoctrinate me into continuing, you know, with this thing. Well, there's, you know, and then there was always this question from me, there's something wrong with you. What's wrong with you? You know, and I lived with that like well into my 40s, feeling like there was just absolutely something wrong with me, that I didn't fit in or whatever. And it was all, you know, it wasn't until like in these last maybe 10, 15 years that I started to deconstruct it for myself. And I had to step away from what I was being fed externally and starting to investigate internally and having a conversation with myself about who I wanted to be, you know. And so
It's interesting you say that. I just find it. If I was bullied, I would be bullied by my brother. You have to find the right bully, because then that bully will protect you.
That's true.
No, but it's interesting because I feel like I was in the system, in the culture, that you always stuck with each other.
Mm-hmm.
So when we went to school, we always stuck with each other. It was always the browns and the whites.
Mm-hmm.
And you protected each other. And you protected each other from bullying or from threats. But even within that system, I felt weird. I didn't feel like I could be myself, because I had to be something. Even though I feel like we have different challenges,
Mm-hmm.
I still felt like unsure about myself. And I felt like I really didn't know who I was. And as a man too, I wanted to break out of it, but I didn't know how to break out of it, out of a culture that you said, that already just being involved, they keep enforcing these rules.
Mm-hmm.
They keep reminding you, no, you're supposed to be this way.
Yeah, that's something that I realized, not to cut you off, but that's one thing that I had realized too, was that I was born into this. And you know, and somehow you end up taking on responsibility for it, and it's not even your baggage. We were born into it, and it was put into us, and then at some point we went out into the world, and we started rubbing up against all of these different things. And I think too, that's where individual expression dies, because there's like this enforced conformity that's being pressed upon you. It's just like, oh well, if you're the different one, then you need to change, or you need to just fit in, you know. And I think also, you know, speaking on an American thing, it's an American thing too. It's like the American culture. Everybody knows, and it kind of knows what it is. I mean, you talk to anybody around the world, oh yeah, that's an American thing. We do have a thing here in America that is uniquely American when it comes to masculinity, and what it looks like and how it shows up in our spaces. Yeah. So I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's perfect. I
Yeah.
mean, I think that this is the whole point. It's just to have these conversations and to talk about your different experience, because I feel like I grew up different than you guys, but we still having to define it for each other, for ourselves within our experience. And I find it fascinating because I could relate to a certain degree of now I'm in my 40s, about unpacking. And I unfortunately had other experience that impact my sense of manliness because of other extraneous situations with family members that challenged my sexuality, which was so entrenched with my masculinity, because you're supposed to find that woman, you're supposed to be married, you're supposed to have family when you're in your 20s, you're supposed to go to church. And so when you don't even know who you are, like sexually as a man, like that's very just confusing to me, and not feeling comfortable talking even amongst my community about it, because I wasn't even, my parents never really talked to me about any of this, especially my dad. My dad just was even though he was not a preacher, what do you call it? A deacon, and he could talk. He was more about talking about the word of the Lord, about, okay, this is how we should be. That was his way of teaching us how to do things. And I don't fault him for that, because he actually did better. I feel like he became a better father than his father, because his father was physically abusive to him. So he was a better father than he was. So you learn, but it's fascinating how we could have different childhood, but at the same time, okay, we still struggle with defining what it really means.
I think, there is something to this whole idea of, because I think at its core, at least I'll say here in America, I can't speak for anywhere else, there's this idea that men are supposed to be providers and protectors. And I've heard that my whole life, provider, protector, provider, protector, provider, protector. But I added another P to that, also pillar, meaning you have to be the staunch, unwavering, unmovable, kind of thing. So provider, protector, and pillar. I mean, how has that affected us? Thinking that this was the goal that was set before us of what we were to be, and and my question then becomes too: does our society set us up for failure when it comes to this very rigid idea of what men and masculinity is supposed to be? Like, for instance, going back to things that both of you brought up about, I remember growing up that when you would watch Leave It to Beaver and that Ozzy and Harriet and all them other shows, there were very gender specific things. Housework was for women, and men did the handiwork and all this kind of stuff. But under that umbrella of provider or taking care of home or housekeeping, even when we use that term, mowing the lawn, fixing the shutters, all that's a part of housekeeping. So that's the confusing part to me, is when we so narrowly define things, or we what's the word I'm looking for, arbitrarily, assign these terms to things and then give them a specific role, and then everybody's supposed to fit in this role, and then everybody starts wondering, well, why am I not happy with my life? How do you guys feel about this idea of men being provider protectors, and like I said, I added my word pillar. What are your thoughts on that?
I think you're right, it's designed to fail. I mean, those constructs are set up in ways that are arbitrary, yet claim to be completely immovable and obvious, and it could be no other way. And so it's hard to think of a man I know in my life who hasn't had a point of just completely like this not working. And I think part of the way I've moved forward from my experience of bullying in elementary school is like mostly building relationships with men who were not fitting in with the macho norm. I just had very little energy for doing the work it takes to bridge that.
You and me both.
And so that biases my sample, right?
Yeah.
That means the people that I know are people who that just does, some aspects of that don't really work.
I personally love that about you, but
and going back to the models we grew up with, part of what's interesting in Mennonite context, the idea of using violence to protect wasn't acceptable. So that's one thing that doesn't fit, right? Because it's a
Okay.
pacifist community.
Okay.
And so then how is that reconstructed in other ways? So maybe it's you might still have but don't share feelings,
Mm-hmm.
and you might have analytical, but you have other ways of protector or provider or pillar being. It's still patriarchal. It's not like it's somehow subverting that completely. But it's put in a different way. So when I came home and talked to my parents about bullying, they didn't tell me like you gotta fight back. They were like, no, sticks and stones might break your bones, and they tried to support me. And I think they struggled too, figuring out what to do as pacifists with physical violence directed at me. And that's still something I think about, like how does masculinity relate to protecting others and protecting ourselves if we're committed to nonviolence? And so those are some of the things that for me have also problematized or like made things more complicated than just that, like you said, the provider, protector, pillar. Like all of those are, they're not true.
Yeah, I think too. In light of what you're saying too, it takes me to like, not that we're gonna get too deep into politics here, but what I was gonna say was, I'm recalling what this current administration, was saying about how their leadership was going to be, and it was, this thing, this moniker, whatever he used, that was saying we're gonna, do this through peace, through strength, kind of thing. And when you see it play out, that's on a national level. But when we talk about bullying, it's about strength. It's about overpowering, like you're saying. It's about control. And so, just like we were saying earlier, just in my thoughts about, this narrow spectrum that men can express their emotions, and usually it's on the more aggressive, violent part of the spectrum. You can't express compassion, feelings, you can't process your emotions, and then people wonder why when men get into relationships, things start falling apart, they become abusive, they beating the wife, they beating the kids, they beating the dog, because they haven't worked things out, for themselves. So, it's like, how do we address that? Because I find it really interesting, with the Mennonite community being passive, I'm
Pacifist, not passive. Yeah.
pacifist,
Yeah.
That's one end of things, and then there's the strength thing. So what's the middle ground?
Yeah.
How do we just, how do we, I don't know, for me, how do we just live?
I don't know the middle ground. I'm still trying to figure, I just want to figure that out. And I just know that it's interesting you say that, because my father always, he's still very prideful about how he was able to raise 5 kids and be successful in their own ways. But it's interesting that he's also very proud of my sisters. And I am too. They're both educated, they stand up for themselves. And I feel like even though he's stuck in his machismo ways, because that's the only ways that he knows, and he was still very forward thinking in allowing my sisters to be empowered, allowing them to be strong in their own ways. And I don't know if that's breaking the cycle or what it's doing, but I know for me it's important to show my daughters that they need to be comfortable in their own skin, they have to be strong. And that's why I feel like it's important for me to keep learning about, okay, what is really masculinity to me. Like the other day, like I have to admit, like I was very hard on my daughter for not cleaning after herself, and especially in the common areas. And afterwards I felt bad, and I had to go back and be like, okay, this is not okay, no matter what the situation is. And I did go back and I said, under no circumstances I should never be mean over, say things that are in the heat of the moment. I actually have to figure out how to communicate what I'm feeling and what's bothering me at a sooner stage before I let it get to me, and it's not her fault that I kept it all in.
Yeah.
It's my fault that I kept it in. That's a whole thing, and admitting to her that no, I made a mistake. Could you apologize? But other than that, also knowing that I could have, hurt her, and I know that she's gonna have to process that, and I know I'm gonna have to have a more of a communication with her. But even that, like, I feel like I do feel proud that my dad at least empowered us to, and it just wasn't my dad. My mom has passed away 12 years, 13 years, but I think about her a lot. I want to say almost every day, because she had a huge impact, because she grew up, she was indigenous, and she was under suppression, but when her mom decided to, leave this world, she took advantage, and she was able to start her own life, and I think that's what she wanted us to do, is us to not follow that system. And I think it takes individuals like that could actually start challenging the system, start challenging those roles, those ways, the concept of what it means your role should be in this community, in this society. But it's still very tricky, because I'm still male, and I'm still hard-headed. So.
Well, I think you said something really important there, Severo, and that is, what do we do when we make mistakes? And I think that's one of the keys. You ask, like, what is the failure point, or what's the alternative? Like, all of those untrue things about pillar, protector, provider that dominant culture says about masculinity, and when there's failure points inside of us and in our friends and in our community, often that can burst out around violence, like you both described in different ways, or turn inward in depression, those kind of things. But if we can just admit that we're all going to make mistakes and then be vulnerable about those mistakes, I think there's lots of stories that we all know and we know around us of men figuring out how to be honest about, wow, I really made a mistake. How can I make it right? And to me, that's really critical, especially because of the areas of privilege I have, like being white, being male, being straight. All those things are areas where I have to be like, okay, I'm going to go through life accidentally hurting people, and how do I consciously try to learn from those mistakes, correct, and talk about the power and privilege dynamics. And that, to me, if I think about what's the emotional, what's the spiritual drive for that, it's like getting back at those bullies, right? So for me, getting back at the bullies is constantly trying to deconstruct the power that it wasn't their fault. That, like we said, that was the thing they grew up in. And so every time I'm able to be like, okay, I'm not going to continue this cycle, or I made a mistake and let's do something different, is a way of, in practical terms, undermining patriarchy.
I agree. There's a couple things, I'll respond to what I'm hearing you say. And I think, because this is something in my personal life that I've been working on in terms of how I want to show up in the world. And, like, there's this political rhetoric that's going around, we need to fight fire with fire. And I'm saying, how much sense does that make? When you fight fire with fire, you get more fire. So for me, the way I've been trying to do it is, if I see fire and it seems like it's getting out of control, how do I become water? And to me, that's solution-oriented living, where you're, if you see hatred somewhere, become love. If you see injustice somewhere, become liberation. Because it to me, it informs a whole different set of tools that you start to work with. When you fight fire with fire, you're using the same thing against you, against them, and where does that lead you? I mean, it just leaves everything burnt to the ground, scorched earth. But in this case, I think your point, even beyond just these role things that we're talking about, this gender or masculinity, just, the humanity of it is having that, that humaneness, the respect for each other. But I think also underneath all of that, because none of that can exist in the world until it exists in the individual. So if somebody has never known how to love themselves or they don't know love, there's no way they can give it to somebody else. You know, and I think that's for me where I'm like, okay, so do I become the person who becomes, you know, even though it's not my fault that a lot of these things in the world exist, but can I take some responsibility and accountability for trying to do something different? You know, and I think that's for me where it starts. You know, and to me that is the strength of a man in everything, but it's steeped in you being a human first, not this constructed role that has been you got to do this, you got to do that, because like get moving to what you were saying, you know, where you're raising your daughters a certain way. Your dad was raising and being proud of your of your daughters and his daughters, and what problems that even creates, because then when you're in this role thing, if you get out there and the man's supposed to be the provider, the protector, and the pillar, but the woman is the one who's making the most money, and she, we start to create problems for ourselves because we have these arbitrary rules that we're supposed to live by. And who's to say if people decide to get into a relationship with one another, if they decide, hey, look, you're capable of going out and making all the money and being the breadwinner, and if we have a family, I'll stay home with the kids as the father. So what? You know what I'm saying? It's like, so what? I mean, to me, it just doesn't make any sense why we're adhering to these archaic patriarchal rules that make absolutely no damn sense to me. They make no sense at all, especially not to where we've evolved. Now, if we were still back in the ancient days or whatever, I mean, can I make an argument? I don't know. But in this day and age, none of that stuff really makes a whole lot of sense to me. So, I don't know. I'll pass it on to y'all.
No, I mean, I agree. I agree with that. I mean, it all starts, why we can't talk about it. I mean, we can. And I think there's examples out there that do talk about couples or whoever challenging the system and the roles. Like you just reminded me of a friend, Tim, and his wife, who she does all the handiwork and he does all the cooking. And so it's out there. There are examples of it, and but there's I guess there's more rhetoric out there on enforcing those dominant roles. Mm-hmm. And like you said, there's just, it's all over. You have social media. I don't do social media, but I hear that they're constantly enforcing those roles. Like my friends, who I sometimes I have to prep myself to be more open-minded, non-judgmental, do share things that they see on social media, and it's very sexist. It's very so, but they believe that that's what they should be as a man out there in the world. Like it reinforces it to them. That's what it tells them, even though I feel like in their heart it's not who they are, because in their heart I feel like you said they love themselves, but they don't. I guess they feel like they should be someone else because they can't be, they're afraid to be who they want to be in this world. And that's hard. That takes a lot of courage. That takes a lot of humility. That takes a lot of compassion, empathy. And I think that's what we're losing a lot. And I also agree with the fire with fire. I think sometimes that doesn't make sense. And again, is it masculinity that's coming into effect? Is that they're just men doing their thing because that's who our leaders are right now? So that's, they want to make sure that they're asserting their power and their control, and I think that right now that's the scary part with me, is seeing all these headlines consistently and being like, this is what we're feeding society. Yeah. And this is what we're reinforcing, and I don't feel comfortable. I don't agree with it, and it comes from a lot of angles. It comes from different sides, political. It doesn't matter what it could be. It could be also sports. It could be religion. Whatever it is, it's constantly reinforcing that. And I think that starting within ourselves is extremely important. With building that stable foundation for us to be okay. We could be okay. We could do this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I like that you raised a word that, really struck me, and that's the word courage. It takes a lot of courage in this world to be different or to challenge the status quo. And I think maybe we can close on this, is that to discuss what does courage look like in the face of all of these things that we've talked about. What does courage face like? Now, as children, we may not have had the space or the agency to be able to challenge things that were given to us, but now as grown men, what does that courage look like for us to help other men be able to question the thing? Because I don't know, for me personally, I come across men in conflict all the time. All the time. And it's exhausting it's exhausting enough to just see it. But then to address it is like, oh, hell no, not today. I'm not doing that. I ain't got the energy. I don't have the patience or whatever, because you got to wade through all of this stuff. So, so how do we become agents to, encourage other men to be able to, live their truth? To question what they've been told, all their life, but they know internally most times that they want to, like you said, want to be or do something different, but the fear of, you name it, prevents a lot of us from doing. I face even some of that even doing this. It's just like, okay, you put yourself out there, you're inviting X, Y, and Z. But to me, to start off, this takes courage. This is the display of courage that it takes to have the conversation, not just with like-minded, but with with others, and and I've done that, and I think I've persuaded some minds, a little bit. But what does that look like for us? The courage component, for us personally, and what we can do out in the world.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to close. For me, as I think about courage, one of the concepts that's really important to me is idea I've been working on with my friend Kazu Haga for about 6 years. It's this idea of fierce vulnerability. So to me, it's a way of talking about the courage you're describing, and also what we've been trying to do this evening. And Kazu talks about how we don't lead with our wounds, we lead with our scars. And so I think that's what we've been trying to do this evening, is to we've all shared stories of pain or difficulty, and the ways especially how masculinity has been enforced or roles have been enforced. And we share those, they don't feel like open wounds, they feel like scars that we're working with. But they're scars nonetheless. And so for me, courage with fierce vulnerability is about being vulnerable and also bringing a fierce honesty and a courage as we share these stories in the hopes of making change.
Mm-hmm. Following that, the vulnerability is a important aspect. And the way I look at it is, we're not all going to agree.
True.
And so I think I have a certain idea of what masculinity is. I could bring my older brother has a completely different idea about what masculinity should be. But having respect there, and an openness to love and respect, I think, because I feel that if it wasn't for his relationship and his commitment to the Catholic Church, he probably would not be here in this world, because that's where he was going. But now he's a beautiful father. We might not agree, but I think that sharing some of those concepts and myself challenging myself, okay, there's different ways of seeing it, but I also struggle with it because I don't agree with it. So it's but I feel like having these conversations and being out there is what courage is. And we've had run-ins with each other where we talk about and we disagree on a lot of stuff, but we've always come back and we've respected each other, and we've had some openness about certain topics. But I think that just having the courage to talk about it and know where at least I come from, and trying not to judge, but trying to be meeting at some type of quality like love and trust and being there for family and community. I think that's not forgetting where we are as humanity, because I agree that's where it starts. Because if we go off that, okay, we're men and women, no, we're all humans too. I think that's important, and I think that's, to me, that's where I would love to start diving into, is what this, because I feel like that's our foundation.
Yeah. For me, I'll say there's a couple of things that have come to mind. I think the best of masculinity, and I know this might take, move us away a little bit from where the course we're on, but I think the best of masculinity also includes having unconditional respect for femininity. And I think that's where we get lost in the society of men, where we define ourselves one way, but we use that as leverage against the feminine. It's man superior, female inferior, kind of thing. And that sets us up for all of the things that we talked about. It's like, well, you're a woman, you do this, I'm a man, and I'm supposed to do this and everything. And then when you fail to do that, then you ain't got nobody to be mad at but yourself, because, us as men, because we created, and not only was it created, we were born into it, but we have to have the courage to challenge it. It's just like, with my thoughts like on racism, for instance, I didn't start racism. I have to deal with it, but I have to, if I want to be the best human being that I can be based on how I see myself, then I can't just let that be. I can't just sit around and be in the company of men, hearing them calling women bitches and hoes and all this kind of stuff, and be okay with it. Because what are you setting this up for? Because I don't know, somehow in the midst of all that, have men forgotten that they come from women? You know what I'm saying? And there's got to be this respect for that. And I think that wholeness that we need is, this the true marriage of male and female needs to happen. I mean, I don't mean in the marital sense, matrimony kind of thing, but, bringing the two sexes together, because that's how we create life in the first place. That's the natural law and order of things. But if we dismiss half of who we came from, then to me that's just absurdity. That's insanity to me. And I think that's what, the world that I'm looking at in that light. So for me, the courage is to, even though it's not comfortable, most of the time I don't feel like doing it, most of the time I don't want to be bothered, but to challenge it. And I'll just, personal anecdote. I mentioned earlier about my mom's boyfriend. He was one of those machismo guys. And at about the age 11 or 12 years old, I still have memories seared in my mind of watching him beat my mother. But he will declare that he's a man and then insist that I follow in his footsteps. And I did, I could not calculate that in my mind, how that was even a possibility. You want me to respect you, you want me to call you dad, but I done sat up here and watch you beat the person that I came from. What kind of respect should I have for you? And that created all kinds of tension in the house that we lived in. And I think it helped shape me to think about, the things in the way that I do. That when you do not have respect for women, in essence, you don't have respect for yourself. That's the bottom line.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because we
Amen
all
to
came
that.
through the womb of a woman,
Mm-hmm.
period.
Mm-hmm.
Full stop. So if we can have the courage to go out into the world and challenge our counterparts and our peers on, you know, behavior that one does not represent ourselves well, but also disrespects the other half of humanity that is integral to our survival, if we can challenge on that level, then I think we might get somewhere. If we can change some minds, if we can change some hearts, you know, um, kids will see a much better model of, you know, adults on both sides. Um, you know, in a more, if they can see more respect, more, you know, more empathy, um, that to me is how you start. You know, that to me in essence is like a true grassroots movement. It begins in the home, and I think we were mentioning that earlier, right? When we go to school, we bring what we brought from home.
Yeah.
So if we can start with, you know, the people that we're in touch with, our friends, people that we talk to, people we run into, like, you know, I remember just, I'll say this one last thing. I was in Home Depot going to get something a couple of years ago, and I was standing in line, and this guy was there, and he had something misogynistic to say about the female clerk. I looked at him like, what's wrong with you? You know, no, I am not going to participate in this with you. Even though I was not going to try to get into a confrontation with him, I like, no, that's not going to happen today. You know, it's uncomfortable. And when I was younger, I had a hard time, you know, embodying that space. But as I've gotten older, it's just like, yeah, this is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And it takes courage to do it. So,
I like that.
any final thoughts?
Here we are. It takes courage.
Yeah. That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I personally want to say thank you
Thank
to
you.
both of you
Yeah.
for, you know, us doing this, and for those who may be watching this, you know, just a little bit of background. I've known Severo for quite a few years, and he introduced me to Tim, and this all started from us deciding to just start having breakfasts like once a month and just talking about stuff. There was no agenda, there was no nothing, and out of that came the desire to do something, and it morphed into this. And so I've been glad to meet you, Tim, and, you know, as always, you know, always good to, you know, engage with you, Severo. So anyway.
No, and I thought it would be a great startup. I would never thought it was gonna be this. Trust me, I didn't think it was gonna turn into this. But knowing Tim's background and how he's really into social justice issues and he's pretty proactive, I just thought that it'd be a good way for us to talk about these issues, because you don't get too much about it, but we need to. I feel like at least for me, I feel like I need to start having more of these discussions, especially with my community.
Well, thanks for bringing us together, Severo.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully there'll be more to come, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
My name is Severo Lara. I would call myself an activist in the community, and I love to collaborate, and I love to meet people, and I always just find it fascinating to think outside the box and seeing, okay, how could we make this world a better place? And that's my...
And my name is Troy Barner, and, you know, the work of doing this to me is true life work. And much like Severo said, you know, making the world a better place should be all of our goal. You know, to start first though with becoming the best version of ourselves, and me participating in this is sharpening myself to become that better person.
Hi, I'm Tim Nafziger, and I live here in Ventura, and I love networking, I love relationship building, I love working with small teams of people around change and how to change for the good of the society and communities we live in. And I write, I'm an organizer, I've worked with lots of different groups. One of the ones I'm working with right now is a group called Mennonite Action, and yeah, my business is also related to conversations. I have a tech business that the entrepreneurship is important to me, and facilitating conversations is part of what I do with my day. Those are meetings with agendas, so it's lovely to have a more informal conversation with the two of you.
Awesome.